Welcome to the 22 Spring Meetings Governor's Talk Series. I am Jihad Azour, Director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department of the IMF. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Jordan Minister of Finance, Mohamad Al-Ississ. Dr. Al-Ississ has been at the helm of Jordan public finance since 2020. He led the negotiation of the current EFF program, one of the first programs approved by the IMF following the COVID lockdown. Prior to becoming finance minister, Dr. Al-Ississ served as Minister of Planning and International Cooperation and as advisor for economic affairs to His Majesty King Abdullah II. Dr. Al-Ississ is a member of the Global Agenda Council at the World Government Forum, a Fulbright scholar, and a published author on a range of topics, including the elasticity of trust, the impact of faith on economic behavior, health reform, and aid allocation. He holds a PhD in economic development and public policy from Harvard University. Minister Al-Ississ, welcome.
My friend Jihad, thank you for having me, sir.
Let me start with the first question. Over the past 2 years, we have overseen an important reform program in challenging circumstances. With the first COVID pandemic and more recently, the spillover from the war in Ukraine. What factors do you think led to the success of your program? And what are for you the lessons and takeaways from Jordan program's experience?
Thank you, Jihad, once again for having me here. As I was preparing for today's conversation, I was reminded by a quote from Great Expectations by Dickens that says, spring is the time when it's summer in the sun and winter in the shade. And this pretty much describes how our people back home feel. They're in the shade of policies we make here in these meetings, in the shade of the pandemic, in the shade of the war in Ukraine. And we must be really very cognizant of that as we design the policies. The previous programs over the past decades with the fund really, I believe they did not live up to the hopes that both our people and the fund aspired to, because there was a missing element of ownership and trust. What sets this program differently is a number of reasons. Number one is ownership and self-diagnosis. We actually in Jordan undertook an evidence-based approach to diagnosing what needs to be done and how it should be done to unlock the binding constraints that are holding us back. The second is, I think both we in Jordan and the fund have invested heavily in trust building and open communications. We discussed openly what can be done, what should be done, and the circumstances surrounding it. Third, I believe, was sequencing, Jihad. I'll give you an example. This program really focused heavily on tax evasion campaigns, and we could not have done it if we did not invest first in building our administrative capacity at the tax department. So when the COVID hit and people were asking for equitable tax treatment and for everybody to pay their fair share, we actually were able to dive in very clearly and ably so in order to deliver with public support. Finally, if I may, I believe the fact that there was flexibility built into the program by design. As you said, this was the first program approved by the fund post-pandemic, and it was the first program to have an adjuster for COVID expenditure. That really removed the pressure on us from having to choose between balancing lives and livelihoods. We responded very quickly to medical need, while at the same time addressing the economic need for the economy to stay sustained in light of the closures and the pandemic.
Let me ask you a follow-up question. How to navigate a program like this in an uncertain environment? Because nobody was expecting COVID to happen, and COVID was, in fact, had a very important toll on your society. How to navigate conflicting objectives?
So I believe Kristalina, a couple of days ago, she gave an interview, Kristalina Georgieva, in which she said, we live in a world where crisis after crisis hits us. And for us in Jordan, that has become business as usual. The past decade has been just one hit after another of exogenous shocks. We sustained 44% of our GDP in exogenous shocks over the past decade, leading from the disruption of our gas supplies from Egypt to the influx of refugees from Syria that increased our population 20% pretty much overnight. to closure of our borders with Iraq as ISIS was approaching the borders. So crisis management became really a way of life, and that's good and bad at the same time. It's good because it meant we actually had the ability to withstand the shock and to respond in a way that protected the lives of our people. It's bad because it's very easy to fall into firefighting mode and to focus on short-term solutions rather than long-term fixes. I'll give you an example. So the previous decade in the previous programs, we did massive fiscal contraction, 14% of GDP. That was done through capex cuts, through subsidy cuts, through increasing regressive taxations. This time in the program, when the fund and us really sat on the table and thought what should be done in light of the circumstances, we decided on the revenue side we're going to do it the right way. So we invested in enhancing efficiency, broadening the tax base, cutting loopholes for evasion and avoidance because it's really not fair. We unified our customs rates so that we limit arbitrage across different rates and across different geographies. On the expenditure, we invested in improving the targeting of our expenditure. So we built a safety net mechanism that really enabled us to reach with high efficiency and targeting to those who are in need. Therefore, we were able to actually support people who need it rather than subsidize goods at large. Across the board, I believe we were able to do all of the above in very uncertain times, but at a high cost. Let me be very clear, Jihad. I think it would be false to assume that we were effective in responding to the aspirations and hopes of our people. We managed to prevent against the worst. But reality is our people have expectations that remain unmet, have desires for employment and prosperity that we have failed, frankly, to fulfill. And we have a limited fiscal space remaining. But we were able successfully to prevent against the worst. I'll close by saying, it's very dangerous in uncertain times, Jihad, to focus on survival mode continuously. We must shift to thriving away from surviving. And this must be, I think, the focus for the next phase.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. But again, we live in a world of uncertainties. And you have been accustomed to uncertainties, not only economic uncertainties, but also geopolitical uncertainties. How one can maintain the, I would say, the aspirational objectives of a reform program while navigating this level of uncertainties? What Jordan's experience and what this program's experience could tell us?
I believe it's key, first of all, to have that trust element, to actually talk first to our people and talk to the fund. The fund have been advisors for Jordan. The fund did not play a role of forcing Jordan to implement policies that Jordan did not believe in, and that's a key success in navigating uncertainty. I believe, Jihad, if we did not have that trust and open communications, we wouldn't be where we are today. I trusted the fund to advise me on how to best navigate the uncertainty. The fund also trusted me when I described to them the intangible circumstances on the ground that made some of these reforms very challenging, and perhaps the time for them was not right. And therefore, that open conversation, that continuous flow between you and I, and between us and our people have been of key importance. Listen, very frankly, Jihad, if there's anything that the past decade has taught us in Jordan, and I think the whole world, is if there's only one certainty, is that uncertainty will persist. And we must learn how to navigate that without losing track of the ultimate objective. The ultimate objective is not firefighting crises. The ultimate objective is allowing our youth to grow, to prosper, to find employment, to prepare for a future that they desire and deserve.
Okay. Now looking forward, this crisis in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia are having impact worldwide and also in our part of the world, in the Middle East and North African countries. I'm sure that this is an issue that you have on top of your mind. How, looking forward, you see Jordan navigating the pressure that this crisis will have on your economy, at the same time preserving what you have achieved over the last few years in terms of implementing all these reforms and doing more?
So I believe a recent IMF report basically stated that as a result of the circumstances that are unfolding in Ukraine, of the Fed reserve adjustments of interest rates, that growth levels in the MENA will be insufficient. And that really means that our people will have less disposable income. Prices of food commodities are increasing, inflation is increasing, fuel prices are increasing. And if history taught us anything, is that usually it's the most vulnerable that will suffer in these circumstances, both at government level and individual level. Therefore, we must really do what it takes to provide protection and safety nets at the individual level. And I think IFIs and the global community at large, as they're designing policies that mainly focus on large economies' needs. So the US economy is heating up, inflation is on the rise, therefore the Fed is rising it. But for countries like Jordan, whose economy have still yet to recover, and that means that we'll pull the brakes on our growth when it's just about to start recovering. And that's concerning. Jordan has prepared well for such crises. We've built our reserves. We've built our wheat reserves for 13 months before the Ukraine crisis. We've locked in long-term fuel contracts. We've built our foreign reserves at the central bank. But at the end of the day, we have very limited abilities to provide the fiscal cushions that are needed to absorb such shocks. Reality is, Jihad, if the Titanic continues to hit one iceberg after the other, people at some point will wake up and say, how come we didn't see it before? They will ask, how come there weren't enough life jackets on board? And we owe them an answer. And I believe the current crises will pose a question of credibility of policymakers across the board, institutions and governments. And we must really rethink our policies in a way that ensure that there is trickle down, that the most vulnerable are protected at the worst times of crises. And I'm very proud that this program with the IMF actually focused significantly on safety nets, on ensuring that as we're cutting fat, we're not cutting muscle, and we're not cutting actually our ability to reach the most vulnerable. I'm really proud that together we were able to prioritize the most vulnerable. Having said that, I believe the current system really needs to adjust, because crises will continue to happen, and we should not act as if we're surprised anymore. We must build buffers. We must build targeting mechanism for safety nets. And once again, the best insurance to do that is to continue the conversation and to maintain the flexibility moving forward when it's needed.
Thank you. Let me build on that. You're mentioning the importance of the trust between a country in program or country in reforms and the partners, and among them the fund. Based on your experience and looking forward, what would be the key principles in building trust and cooperation between Jordan and international institutions, and how we as international institutions should adapt to address issues of food security, or also the risks of high inflation and its impact on macroeconomic stability, as well as also on social?
I believe, first of all, there is no alternative to a country owning what it wants to do. What is the aspiration that the country has? In Jordan, we have 1 in 2 unemployed among the youth, and this is our #1 concern. And therefore, we designed policies that aim to unlock the binding constraints to growth and job creation. When I reach to the fund listens, and they come back with solutions that will help me implement the program. It's been never the case whereby I felt that we must do policy reform that I do not believe in because the fund is pressuring us, and that's key. We have the joint communication and diagnosis of the problem going forward. That's #1. #2, I think it's really important. When one does diet, one learns very quickly that all calories are not created the same. That whether you cut healthy calories is very different than whether you cut bad calories. And the same, I think, when it comes to fiscal consolidation. We have fiscally consolidated by cutting healthy capex. We have fiscally consolidated by increasing regressive taxation and by cutting subsidies to those who need it. I don't think that worked. And I think the lesson that we all converged in designing this program is we must do the hard reforms that will focus on building the healthy calories rather than the bad calories. And that's why I'm reassured of its sustainability, meaning this is socioeconomically stable. Our people want us to fight evasion and avoidance. This is their demand that we're responding to. They're not seeing us increasing marginal taxation on them while we're leaving the rich and powerful untouched, and that's key. So we must design policies that are socioeconomically stable and sustainable. And the result? Well, last year, 2021, was one of the first years in a long time where not only did we meet our domestic revenue projections in the budget, we actually exceeded it. And we exceeded it without raising marginal taxes a penny. We've done it through the hard grunt work with the support, technical support and otherwise, of our development partners, such as the IMF and others. But most importantly, we did it in a way that was responding to people's demands in equitable taxation and progressive taxation, not otherwise.
Interesting. You are here coming back to the importance of institutions, the importance of governance in building trust, something that you have done some research on. What are the key lessons that you have learned during managing both the program and the crisis in terms of the importance of the role of institutions? You mentioned several examples of your ministry and how both in terms of revenue management, but also in terms of social and expenditure management, you upgraded the system. What are the key lessons that you learned from this experience?
I believe, Jihad, there is no alternative to well-functioning institutions. One person can lead for a bit, but if the institution is not built in a way to continue and maintain that, policies will revert and pressures will build up. So we must, as we're firefighting crises, invest in building institutions, invest in educating and building the capacity of our teams. This should not be a job of a single man or woman heroes. This should be an institutional capacity build-up that is well fit to respond to unexpected crises. I think that's number one. Number two is, for a country like Jordan, which has undergone tremendous reforms after reforms, it's really important to remember that reform for its sake is not the objective. Reform for unleashing growth and providing hope for our youth is the objective. And therefore, we must avoid changing the rules of the games, which are what institutions are at the end of the day, repeatedly. We should focus our ability on hitting the binding constraints really hard, and we should have an institutional capacity to respond to that. I'll give you an example. The first thing we've done when we started the program is invest heavily in reforming our tax administration, reforming our tax legislations, closing the loopholes, building the IT capacity, building the infrastructure. We reached a point where we are actually able to well target those who are evading without hurting those who are complying. Because if we actually did not have that right sequence, we would have gone after those who are in compliance, and that would not have been fair, and it would have quickly backfired. When it comes to institutions, I think the real lesson is we have to have the humility to respect the fact that our institutions need a time to respond and build, and we need to have the humility to understand when we make mistakes and to correct them. Stubbornness when it comes to policy making is very dangerous. We must have a feedback loop, and that feedback loop should really be humble enough to admit when it makes mistakes, because invariably, if you're going to reform, you're going to make mistakes.
And how about the communication issues with the population?
So this is actually key, and I'll be very frank, it's one of the issues that I don't feel we have captured in the right way yet. Our region has gone through tumultuous crises over the past couple of decades. That left our people really with frankly well-deserved concerns about the credibility of the reform and how it will help them and benefit them. They've seen many policies fail them. They've seen regional conflict hit them. They've seen themselves playing host to refugees that are roughly 20% of the population, yet the rest of the world is not stepping up to their job, and we're left to pick up the bill. So there is a justifiable sort of hesitation to accept the premise of what the reform will deliver. What I found really helpful here is to actually understand that this hesitation is well-founded in real causes, and to have the humility yet again to admit that we have made mistakes in the past and we will continue to make mistakes. But if we don't reform, the status quo will prevail. And the status quo is not healthy for anybody. It's not healthy for the youth who is well-educated but very frustrated because they can't find a job. Well-exposed, but they don't have the access to tools to enable them to start their own job or enter the job market. Have well-deserved dreams, but have seen frustrations hit one time after another. They've seen uncertainty prevail every step of their life. Have seen that iceberg in our face, and we're failing to swerve around it. Their concerns are legitimate, and we must be humble enough to admit that we have failed them, and we need to do what it takes to live up to the promise so that this generation becomes the last generation in our region that lives a life of uncertainty and frustration.
Let me build on that and maybe ask you my last question or so. What would be your message to the youth in Jordan and also to the youth in the region that currently, after a crisis that was portrayed as a crisis like no other, now we are facing a new one at a time where we were about to recover from the previous one with a higher level of unemployment, especially at the youth level. What would be your message today to this young generation in Jordan and in the region? What are the priorities you see for them? How we could build a transformative recovery that would allow them to have a better chances than the current generation in terms of access to job, access to opportunities, but also access to good life?
I will keep it short because, frankly, Jihad, I have to learn more from them than them from me. I will start by saying your pain is real and your aspirations are just. And if we don't, as policymakers, step into actions in a wise manner now, you will inherit very deep scarring in the future. The IMF predicts that by 2026, growth in the MENA will be 6% less because of the current crisis than currently. That means that they will inherit our failures in very few years. And therefore, I believe the message to them is you should do to yourselves what we've done in the program that we're just describing. You should self-diagnose where you are, where you want to be, and don't wait for people to step in and be your saviors. You are your own saviors, and you should really move towards what needs to be achieved very boldly. This generation in many ways is full of contradictions. They're the best educated but the least likely to find jobs. They have global exposure, but they're not empowered to change their unemployment. Many people call them the lost generations, although I think they are our last hope to recover. To them, I will close with what I started, with another quote from Dickens's Great Expectations. I was too coward to do what was right even though I knew it, and I was too coward to avoid what's wrong although I knew it. We have a lot to learn from this generation, and this generation deserves the right to have a better future, and we must do what it takes to change this uncertainty.
Great. Time is running. Minister Al-Ississ, I want to thank you for sharing your experience, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. From the IMF headquarters, we wish you all a very good day and good spring meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.